Okay, chapter 6.2 in your book is about division of fractions by whole numbers. For all of these questions, what we're going to do is we're going to think of these problems as being sharing chocolate bars between friends. So if you look at your first one, A, it says 3/4 divided between 3. So what we'll do is we'll draw a chocolate bar that represents 3/4 of a chocolate bar. One piece, two piece, three pieces out of four pieces means 3/4. Now, if I was to share this between three people, this one's kind of easy because each of these three pieces would be given to three people. So we'll call this one Al, Bob, and Chris, ABC. So each of those parts of the 3/4 would be shared between three people, in this case Al, Bob, and Chris, which means Al would get a quarter, Bob would get a quarter, and Chris would get a quarter. So therefore, 3/4 divided between three people would mean each person gets a quarter. In the second example, we have 5/6 of a chocolate bar shared between two people. So if we draw this one and put 5/6, so we're going to go cut it in half, and then each of these cut it into two equal lines. 5/6 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5/6 of a chocolate bar. Now for this one, I can't divide it like I did in the first example without cutting, because I have five pieces to share between two people. So some people say, well, you have 2.5/6. Some people would say you have 2.56, which is not wrong, but the problem is that fractions don't contain decimals in their numerators or denominators. So we have to express that as a fraction that does not contain a decimal. So for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut this chocolate bar this way to share between Al and Bob. And when I cut it that way, I changed the denominator of my fraction. The denominator of my fraction used to be 6, but by cutting it that way, I've now made the denominator of my fraction 12 because there are 12 pieces altogether now. And of those 12 pieces, Al is going to receive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/12 of the chocolate bar to eat. So the answer for 5/6 divided by 2 is 5/12. So 5/6 divided by 2 is equal to 5/12. Okay? Let's look at the second show you knows. So in these ones it says determine each quotient using a diagram. Again, express each in lowest terms. So this time we have half a chocolate bar shared between 5 people. And if I look at half a chocolate bar and I divide it in half and I shade it in, and I say, okay, I got to share that between 5 people. So I'm going to cut it 5 times. Actually, I'm going to cut it 4 to make 5 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. That makes 5 pieces. This will be for Al, for Bob, for Chris, for Doug, and for Elijah. Those are going to be the 5 people that get to share in this half a chocolate bar. When I re-examine the new chocolate bar, I realize that there used to be 2 pieces, but now there is 10 parts. And if I look at what Al gets 1 part out of 10, or 1/10. So 1/2 divided by 5 is 1/10. Now there's an interesting way to change that to see if that makes sense, and that is to change it to percentages instead of just fractions. So if I think about 1/2, I think all of us know that that is 50%. And if I asked you what is 50% divided by 5, most of you would be able to say, without even drawing it, that the answer is 10%. So if you had 50% of a chocolate bar divided between 5 people, each person would get 10%. So when I look at my answer that was a fraction, it now makes sense because 10% as a fraction is 1/10. So it kind of makes it a little bit more realistic in terms of why is the fraction divided by a whole number equal to 1/10. When I think of it in percentages, it makes sense. The second one is 3/5 divided between 3 people. So this is interesting because this fraction, let me just try 3/5. So 1, 2, 3, 4 cuts make 5 parts. 1/5, 2/5, 3/5. Now for this one, I don't need to cut it again. See, this is one of those examples like the first one, that if I have 3/5 of a chocolate bar shared between 3 people, Al will get this piece, Bob will get this one, and Chris will get that one. Which means that Al is receiving 1/5 of the chocolate bar. So 3/5 divided by 3 is 1/5. However, if you did cut it, it doesn't make it wrong. So if I was to cut it here and here, cut it into 3 parts, and instead of giving Al, Bob, and Chris those parts, if I gave Al, Bob, and Chris these parts, well, my denominator changes. It used to be 5. It's now 15. And Al will get 1, 2, 3 parts of those 15. The only difference is 3/15 in lowest terms. I can divide by a common factor of 3. Give me 1/5 as my answer still, even though 3/15 was my answer the other way. In lowest terms, it still represents 1/5 of the chocolate bar. Okay? And again, if we think of it as percentages, 3/5 is 60%. 60% divided by 3 would equal 20%. And if I double check what 1/5 is using a calculator, I think most of us know this, but anyway, 1 divided by 5, that fraction, equals decimal 2, which is 2/10, which is 20%. Okay? And the last show you know, it says 4 students equally shared half a cake. What fraction of the cake did each student eat? So here is the cake. Here is half of the cake. If 4 students share it, I have to cut it into 4 equal pieces. This is student A, B, C, and D. So before there was 2 parts, now there is 8 parts, and student A would get 1/8. And if I wanted to think about that as percentages, 1/8 as a percentage, take my calculator. 1 divided by 8 is 0.25, or 0.125, which is 12.5%. So if I take 50% of a cake, divide it between 4 people, each person would still get 12.5%. Okay, hopefully that helped you. So for all of these questions that are fractions divided by whole numbers, if you think of it as being chocolate bars and physically cut them into parts to share between that many people, it starts to make sense. And if you want to check your answer, convert the fraction to a percentage and divide that percentage by the number of people, and you should have the fraction answer and the percentage answer be the same thing.